Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Come on in, grab a seat. The weather's fine. We will get started in just a moment. We'll give everybody a chance to settle in, get comfy, sit on their favorite cushion. My name is Rob McCackey. I am the Senior Business Development Manager for Spirits and Sake for WSET Americas, the Wine and Spirit Education Trust. And this is the fourth in our series of webinars, Is More Better? Simplifying Your Back Bar. These have been great fun so far. So each week I have a guest with me and we talk about if you had to have a more streamlined offering in your beverage program, what would you pick and why? So far we have covered such subjects as cognac and armagnac, American whiskey and rum. And today we're going to be taking a little look at aromatized wines. First off, a little housekeeping. Just make sure your sound is turned up. If you see my mouth moving and you can't hear me, you should probably turn it up. You might be on mute. Also, we will be recording this session and everyone will receive a link, if not tomorrow, within the next couple of days. Feel free to ask questions. These sessions are always a lot more fun when we aren't just making stuff up. So you can use the chat feature. Our producer behind the scenes, Tommy, will make sure that they're age appropriate and he will share those with us. And Jake and I will pause throughout the seminar to answer those and cover any that are remaining at the end. Don't worry if you miss the products with the styles of aromatized wines we're talking about today. We will put up a little slide at the end with an overview of those as well as our contact detail. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce my illustrious companion on today's journey. Good afternoon, Mr. Parrott. Jake Parrott, how are you, sir?
Good afternoon, Dr. McCackey. It's great to be here with all of you today. We're not going to simplify your back bar today, but we are going to simplify your refrigerator. Because as you know, all these things, when they get open, need to go in the refrigerator.
So would you like me to tell people who you are? Or would you like to tell people yourself, Jake?
Your lies are better than mine, so I will let you.
That's what my wife tells me anyway. So Jake is the National Sales Manager for Haus, Alpenz and Sotolon Selections, and they are one of the finest purveyors, if not the finest purveyors in the land of all things aromatized and much more beyond. So you can, we'll have a link to their website at the end so you can check out their fabulous portfolio. And Jake has long been a big advocate for aromatized wines, low alcohol cocktails. He's generally got some cheese and salumi somewhere about his person to pull out and wax lyrical of the throw of a die. So it's very exciting to have Jake with us today. How are you, sir? How has life been?
I'm doing all right. Very fortunate to have a little space to set up and chat with all of you today.
It actually looks like a cool green screen behind you. I'm waiting to see like 3D sharks and stuff come on out.
Right. Well, the only background image I have is an image of Rob, and so I figured that was probably not appropriate for today.
So let's get stuck in. So I think the premise of this, when we've asked all of our guests so far, has been to, if you had to narrow your selection and only have 5 of a particular category to showcase the world of that category and to give you the most flexibility in how you would use it, showcase it, prepare it, what would you use? So with aromatized wines, I think maybe the first thing that would be useful to do, and I know this is a conversation that you and I have had a lot, is to break down what it is that distinguishes different aromatized wines from each other. So kind of some of the key factors, and then we can kind of take a little look at what you have picked and why. How does that sound?
Sure. I'd like to kind of do 2 things. One is a brief look at what is in an aromatized wine, but then also, to talk about what does it mean to streamline the aromatized wines in your setup. How to think about what you might want, and then how to taste and evaluate aromatized wines against those criteria. Aromatized wines at their simplest core are wine. Wine that's generally fortified, generally sweetened, and generally has a key bitter botanical. And that bitter botanical is an important part of, for almost all aromatized wines, is the core, forms the core of their history. The most common style is vermouth, and vermouth is so named because it's bittered with wormwood. And when people first started to commercialize vermouth in the 1700s, even though making it goes back to ancient Greek times, it was the desire for wormwood that was as much or more the consideration, the business consideration, that's the desire for wine. Each area of the world that is known for aromatized wine can have some stylistic differences. And then there's also a really important stylistic difference that we'll go back to over and over again in terms of how much sugar producers tend to add based on what their local market wants. And what we generally find is that aromatized wines that come from France tend to be a bit drier than those that come from Italy. And if you look at sort of the core of most of the world of aromatized wines, you're looking at France and Italy. There are some wonderful new artisanal producers out there from all over the world. Certainly Spain has a long history as well. But most of what you see show up in old cocktail books, and much of what you see that show up in the catalog of companies like ours are going to be from France and Italy. In terms of what you're looking for as you streamline, you want each of those aromatized wines to be versatile. You want to be able to serve them in a simple way as an aperitif. You want to be able to mix them, have a defined idea of what spirits you want to mix with them, and that each wine have a lot of different uses in that way. You certainly want some diversity in style. How bitter is each of them? What bitter botanical each of them uses, so that you have different palate effects. And then certainly how much you taste the wine. Some aromatized wines, the wine flavor is a really important part of it. Others, the wine is just there for texture and acid. And then, of course, the sweetness thing that we're talking about. So there's a variety of ways that you can taste to evaluate for those kind of things. One I always think about is taste these things cold. When you're tasting to evaluate, taste an aromatized wine cold. You're going to serve it cold and you're going to store it cold. So taste it cold. Yes, if you're purely doing a sensory evaluation, then you want a sort of cellar temp. But for your bar, you want to taste these things cold, and you want to taste them diluted. Dilute with regular water. That's a very classic technique that the Wine and Spirit Education Trust teaches. But also, in this case, I like to taste diluted with soda water as well. And soda water helps you kind of start thinking about, how could I build a very simple cocktail with this aromatized wine? And then last, I think when you're evaluating, you want to have, again, that library of spirits that you can mix with each aromatized wine for menu cocktails. And in that case, I always like to taste those kind of mixtures at equal parts of the spirit and the wine. It may not be what the drink ends up being, but I think it's the best way to see how each component shows in the mixture. And you may find a lot more of those 50-50s work better than you think. And simpler drinks in a new time of less staffing and a lot more considerations around getting a drink to a table, being able to make a drink faster is going to be really, really important.
A lot to unpack there, and I think you touched on some really interesting things. I mean, for me, when you mentioned kind of the history dating back to kind of ancient Greece and that, I mean, I'd take it back even further. You can look at things like chrysanthemum wines from ancient China and things like that. I mean, these are not new ideas. The idea of bittering and sweetening an alcoholic base to create a pick-me-up, a tonic, has a long, illustrious history. So, and I think that's where a lot of these drinks that we now consider to be our staples stem from. And I think, thinking about it and coming up with five, I think there's a certain group of people and a certain selection of bars and restaurants that are maybe going to say, why do I need 5 aromatized wines? Because, I think there is unfairly this perception sometimes that all vermouths are the same, and vermouth is all aromatized wines. And as I think we'll touch on in this session, there are Americanos, there are Quinquinas, there are Amari, there are lots of these other bittered beverages that I think showcase so much variety based on those different elements that you touched on, that hopefully will help people realize that there is benefit in having a broad section of styles and aromas and flavors to play with, particularly when it comes to mixed drinks, and whether that's low ABV cocktails because we're all a little bit more socially responsible these days, whether it's just because we want a nice highball, whether it's because we're looking to add some interesting modifiers to our spirits. I think that having that array of different styles there is hugely beneficial. So why don't we jump in, Jake? What is your first kind of essential style. And I want to let everybody know we're not going to be naming brands today, and we're not going to be calling out specific products. Again, we're just going to be considering those kind of key styles, what their attributes are, and how best to utilize them, which is ultimately what's important. It's all well and good having something on your back bar, but if you don't know how to talk about it, sell it, drink it, it's just going to sit there, unfortunately, and that's money on a shelf. So, Jake, what is choice number one? I feel like I should say that in the style of like a train platform announcer. Please mind the gap between the train and the platform edge. So,
so I think style number one will come as no surprise to anyone. It's for the American bar, the classic American bar is such an iconic style, and that's dry vermouth. The martini, of course, has engendered argument after argument after argument, but dry vermouth is going to be a core in virtually any classic bar program. It's certainly, unless all you serve is margaritas, you're going to need dry vermouth at some point. Now, while there are many wonderful drinks for which dry vermouth is even the base, and certainly at our company, we spend a lot of time talking about using a lot of dry vermouth in the martini because it's a great way to start a meal if you don't make a drink that's super boozy. There's some core things that I think are really important for dry vermouths if you're going to use them a lot of different ways. It's got to be pretty clean. It's got to be pretty dry. Dry vermouths generally are not bone dry, but it should be pretty dry so that you have maximum flexibility if you want to do a drink with multiple sweeteners. And it should taste good with the gin that you want, the gins you want to make martinis with, either in small or large proportions, because you're going to have that diversity in your customer base of how they're going to want a martini made. And you're going to want to be able to be confident to make that martini at a lot of different proportions. So there's a lot there. In terms of other ways of tasting dry vermouth for evaluation, I think it's always helpful to taste it with a splash of tonic. That can be also a really tasty, relatively dry aperitif that can often take a cute garnish, like a grapefruit peel or maybe a little gooseberry if you get those in stock. And you know, I think the more that you taste dry vermouth, the more you realize why there's so many more dry vermouth drinks in the classic cocktail canon than just the martini.
I mean, it is, and it's just it's the quintessential part, I think, of the category that you kind of have to start there. I think it's iconic in so many ways that, in terms of flavor profile, in terms of branding and positioning, I think it's. But I think it's important to understand that it isn't as shelf stable as a spirit. It does need to be stored correctly. It does need to be fresh. I mean, there is nothing worse than old, stale vermouth. You know, I think it's one of those things. So I think it's important to understand, treat it like wine, treat it like you would a wine, and once you open it, drink it. You know, like any good beverage. Once you've opened it, you don't really want to sit around too long. I mean, what do you tend to recommend to people, Jake, in terms of shelf life once things are open?
I think you have to start taking a good hard look at 2 weeks. And then after that, follow your nose. In general, the things that will last longer open are things that are sweeter and things for which the delicate characteristics or the particular characteristics of the base wine are less as an important a part of the overall flavor profile. Because certainly the wine that flattens, the wine is what is flattening, and the wine has to be at least 75% of what's in the aromatized wine. But you'll get the aromatic flattening before you get the flattening of the texture and the acidity. I am not hearing Rob. Tommy, are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. Rob is pixelated and I do not hear anything he's saying. Can you hear him?
No.
Okay. Would you like me to continue? Okay. Rob is having some technical difficulties. I hope you all can hear me pretty well. I will go ahead and talk about number 2 on our list of aromatized wine categories that are important for the streamlined bar for your refrigerator. And category 2 is just as elemental as category 1. Category 1 was dry vermouth, and category 2 is red vermouth. Red vermouth, the core of the Manhattan and the Negroni, which if your bar has anything to do with the world of classics, or 2 drinks you're going to make a ton of. But to get to one red vermouth for your bar, there's some general considerations, I think, and then some particular considerations. I think the reason why red vermouth is red is because it has some caramelized sugar in it. Caramelized sugar is a great thing for a red vermouth. It brings sweetness, it brings flavor, it brings color, it brings a nice little supplemental bitterness, and it brings texture. But if you go overboard with the caramel, or if you feel like when you taste the red vermouth, it's going overboard with caramel, you can start to lose the nuance of what else is going on when it's cold, when the vermouth is cold. So, be mindful of that. Color doesn't always tell you everything, so you'll have to taste it. But you want a moderate amount of caramel, no more, in your aromatized wines. In terms of sweetness level, here, remember, you have this very keen dichotomy between French and Italian red vermouths, or aromatized wines in general. And how sweet you want kind of depends on what whiskeys you're going to make Manhattans with. If you're making Manhattans with relatively moderate proof whiskeys, then you're going to want a drier red vermouth, or else the red vermouth will obliterate the nuance of the whiskey. If you're making your whiskeys with higher proof, or older, or pretty much all with rye, then you might want a little bit sweeter red vermouth, which will kind of stand up to the wood lignins, the wood tannins, if you will, of that bigger whiskey. Remember that the whiskeys that we make cocktails with today, by and large, are younger and more primary than whiskeys that people made cocktails with when everyone wrote down all the famous whiskey cocktails. So you do have to deal with that little more pertinent amount of wood in the Manhattan, and that can lead to a degradation of texture if you're not careful. So you need a little texture there. If you decide that you want a drier red vermouth because you're making a lot of Negronis, remember Negroni has another very sweet element in it, the red bitter, then don't be afraid to use that drier red vermouth for Manhattans. Just use a little bit more. The whiskey will show through really well, and I think it'll work out pretty darn well for you. And if you're looking for a little cheeky, extra little fizzy drink for your red vermouth, put a nice bit of spicy ginger beer in it, and I think you'll really dig it. So red vermouth is not just about Manhattans and Negronis. I personally am a Rob Roy drinker, so that's a big part of my fun. Oh, Rob is back. Rob, you just missed me talking about red vermouth.
Great. Apologies for that, everybody. These are the joys of the digital age. I blame the weather here in Carolinas. Very good. So you've covered number 2. You've covered red vermouth, and
Yeah.
Were you talking about Manhattans in terms of?
Yeah, just talking about Manhattans and Negronis. What whiskeys you're making Manhattans with. If they're more delicate whiskeys, you want a drier red vermouth. If they're more robust whiskeys, you want a sweeter red vermouth. But in neither case do you want a ton of caramel. And I'll throw in a personal palate note from my perspective is I like a bit of acidity in red vermouth. Whether or not that acid is part of an overall large characteristic of the base wine, like you see in some Vermouth di Torino from Italy. But I like a little bit of acidity in red vermouth because I think if you're having a Manhattan before dinner, it ought to put you in the mood to have dinner.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of reverse Manhattans as well. I think I think using the vermouth as the start with a spirit as a modifier, whether that's a rye whiskey, which would be my favorite, whether that's a bourbon, whether that's even a cognac. I think for me, that's a delicious thing. And being lower proof, you can then drink 4 or 5 of those instead of just 1 or 2, which is a win-win for everybody except my wife. So I think it is, really, really important to be able to have that versatility and flexibility when understanding how to use these spirits. So yeah, I think that idea of, and I think there's you touched on an important thing here as well. I think there's this historical idea that there is only one way to make a Manhattan, and regardless of what your spirit is, which to me is kind of silly. I mean, depending on the mash bill in the bourbon, or depending on if you're using a rye or if you're using a cognac, you're gonna have to tweak the ratios. I mean, this is the same for, I get upset when people say Negronis can only be made one way, and I think, well, that all depends on what you're using as those three elements. And I think recipes are great as a guideline, but understanding how things actually taste and how things work together is key to getting that balance right. And it's all about balance. It's all about an integration, a cohesion between those disparate elements to create something that's greater than the sum of its parts. I think once people tend to understand that, they tend to be much more successful, not just when making drinks, but when creating their own drinks as well.
Yeah, one of the other things that we talked about while you were off in the wilderness is that whiskeys today that are priced for mixing tend to have a more kind of primary wood, call it lignin or tannin element, than the whiskeys of a century ago, and that's yet another argument for not being afraid to use a gentler whiskey in a Manhattan and not being afraid to use a little bit more vermouth in a Manhattan.
For sure, for sure. And I think, again, it's just understanding your ingredients and how to get the most out of them. I think that's key with all of this. Great. So we've got 2 down and 3 to go. And we've got about 35 minutes left. So I'm feeling good now. We're cooking with gas. So what is your aromatized wine number 3?
Well, I think we can stay on the brown train here for a little while and talk about,
Nice.
and this is a broader category. Something, the first way I would say it is something else to go with brown spirits, whether that's a quinquina, a quinine bittered wine with a fair amount of caramel, or dark spice character, or what is becoming a growing array of wine-based amari. It's funny to say a growing array because before 1919, virtually all amari made by small producers were wine-based because alcohol was so expensive. So they'd buy a little bit of alcohol to make their extracts, but they wouldn't do 30, 35, 40% alcohol amari because it was just, it didn't make sense. But if you were a small producer and you were in a little valley, say in the Alto Adige or in Piemonte, you had plenty of wine available. And the wine brought a lot of flavor and texture and acid and grittiness to the party. So you can go, there's a continuum of flavors here, but the overall consideration is something that's a little bit sweeter, has a certain brown character, a spice or richer bitter character, and preferably isn't another vermouth, although there certainly are big, robust vermouths that would work in this context. Now, in addition to brown spirit cocktails with those wines, those are often really cool pairings for cheese or dessert. So they're a great way. And if you're doing takeaway and someone buys a cheese plate as a takeaway, this is a really cool value that you can provide to them at a relatively reasonable price for say a 3-ounce pour or 4-ounce pour for 2 people to have with that cheese or that nut dessert. This category is also really helpful if the bar person is into bitter stuff, but maybe your customers aren't as into bitter stuff. Having a brownish but wine-based bitter thing, it still comes across as wine to the guest in a lot of ways, and they expect and understand the texture and acid of wine. You can also do sweeter, longer drinks with that. Our old friend ginger ale rears its ugly head here too, or maybe even with a bit of nice local hard cider or soft cider as we get to the autumn. So this is where you can really have some fun, turn on a lot of new people to the bittersweet world, but also come up with really interesting boozy drinks and really interesting long drinks and have fun with food.
It's that flexibility, isn't it? I think it's not thinking that these things are one-trick ponies. Understanding their versatility, I think, is gold. And I think when you talk about Italy, I think it's really interesting when you think about the geography of Italy. Historically, it's relatively rocky terrain. There's mountains, there's rivers. Each kind of province, each area, each community developed its own cuisine, its own drinking history, its own cultural kind of energy around food and drink. It was almost like I mean, it really was a bunch of
Had their own bitter botanicals.
Identities, you know. So there is this idea of each kind of town having its own amari, its own aromatized wine that I think is such an interesting part of it. And you look at the differences in the cuisine of southern Italy versus northern Italy, and you know, things that you might have with different cheeses or even chocolate. I mean, for me, that classic kind of after dinner double espresso and something bitter to something kind of bittersweet to accompany that is just, it's just a classic way to finish a meal for me. And I'm not someone who enjoys particularly big, heavy, dense, sweet desserts, particularly after a rich meal. So that I'm a big fan of the cheese board at the end of the meal. You know, that idea of just a nice selection of cheeses with some nuts and something kind of nice to end the meal on. And you know, I don't like getting caught up with things like aperitif and digestive because I think they're kind of less than helpful in terms of ways of categorizing these products. But I think it is just a great way. There is a aromatized wine and aromatized wine that can work with every course of a meal, I think, including kind of before the meal starts and to bookend at the end. And I think that is something that more and more people are starting to kind of tap into and understand. And I think that's a very exciting time for aromatized wines in general.
Yeah, I think you know, we if you go to our website, you'll see a lot of information about pairing aromatized wines with food on each of the product pages. And you know, there are some things. It's not just random. There are some ways to think about it in a little more systematic way. You know, at your core, what are you pairing aromatized wines with? You're pairing, you know, most of them are drunk as aperitifs, so you're pairing them with aperitif foods, things that are salty, cheeses, pickled things, olives, charcuterie, salumi, etc. And so one of the things that we like to think about is what's going on when you drink an aromatized wine and eat a food like that. You've got a few different things. You've got the salt of the food interacting with the sugar. That's the kettle corn effect. Everybody likes that. Or, you know, Rob just moved to North Carolina. I'm sure he's learning to put syrup on his bacon. You know, but also salt reduces the perception of bitterness. So if you're drinking something that's rather bitter, that salt will actually round out the flavors. If you don't want to think about that from a drinks perspective, think about salting a vegetable soup and how that opens up the flavors of the vegetables in a soup. At the same time, though, bitterness scrubs fats and proteins off the tongue. It does a much more complete job of refreshing the palate than normal wine does. And last, you know, Rob says he doesn't want to talk about aperitifs and digestives. I'll talk about them. They're the same thing. They do all the same things physiologically. And so if you serve something bittersweet with something salty before dinner, one of the things that bittersweet is doing is helping you stay hungry for dinner. If you serve a bittersweet with something salty like cheese after dinner, what that bittersweet is doing is keeping you from feeling completely full. And so, you know, we talked about regionalization, hyper-regionalization in Italy. Well, that transcends over to bitter botanicals as well. We have a producer in Piemonte that uses a cardoon that it's only grown in this one town in Piemonte, Nizza Monferrato, as the main bitter in one of their wine-based amari. We have a producer in the Alto Adige that uses a scrub pine called mugo, which primarily appears in the Dolomite Mountains, which is where they are, as the core bitter element in one of their wine-based amari. And that's, you know, those local identity things are fun as a marketing thing, but it also leads to this diversity of taste that we get to have so much fun with.
It does, and food is such an important part of drinking as well. And I think it's really important to understand that in terms of those basic gustatory senses, a spirit doesn't really have that spectrum of tastes that an aromatized wine does. You don't really have acidity in a spirit. So bringing that element into a mixed drink so that you get a more complete flavor experience is going to make a much more effective pairing, even if you're having some snacks at the bar. You know, there's nothing I enjoy more than watching a hockey game at the bar, eating food, you know, but having something that's got to pair with that food that has more than just kind of bitter astringency from tannins, maybe a little bit of sugar depending on what it is. And outside of that, there's a textural lack for want of a better term, whereas an aromatized wine fully meets that remit that my palate is craving when I'm sitting at a bar, when I'm eating. And I think that's using salt, I think, is really interesting. Like some of my favorite cocktails use salt in the cocktail because salt
That's
is a
right.
classic way of tempering bitterness in a mixed drink. I mean, I love a bit of salt on my hanky panky. You know, I think there are great ways of adding salt to a drink to use as a modifier, as well as, you know, citrus juices, as well as other modifiers in a cocktail. Salt is absolutely a seasoning that can be used in a cocktail that I think, you know, more and more people are starting to recognize and tap into, which I think is really, really interesting. And I think there's a big part of taste as well that we underestimate, and that's the importance of texture, the tactile sensation of drinks. And I think this is where, and with food as well. I mean, we've talked about this before. When you think of that kind of cooling effect of mint or sage, or you think of that the capsaicin effect of chili, I think there's some interesting interplays there that aromatized wines do a much better job of pairing with than spirits on their own.
There's a lesson we can learn from Sichuan cooking here. Really great Sichuan dishes that are hot and spicy always have not just the numbing element from the mala peppercorn, but also an element of bitterness, usually from herbs. And it is incredible, the palate effect, and how it keeps both your mouth happy and your stomach happy. And of course, if you have something bittersweet in the glass next to that kind of dish, it's going to help even more.
For sure. And this is this idea of kind of eating and drinking small cups of something to drink to go alongside a meal. It all creates this that you know it's better for your digestive system. You know, it's a more complete experience, I think, when there's a symbiosis between these things that you can't overlook. Okay, that's where we're up to. That's 3 things. So we've had a dry vermouth, a red vermouth, and another potentially a Mari style beverage as well. So where are we heading for number 4 on our magical mystery tour?
All right, lest you think we forgot about clear spirits, the rest of this seminar is devoted to clear spirit mixing. So the next one we're going to talk about is an aromatized wine that we want an aromatized wine that goes well with clear spirits, and we want one that's on the dry end, not as dry as a dry vermouth, because that's a whole other flavor profile. Something that has some sweetness but is on the dry end, and generally what you see out in the world that works in that context is what is referred to as blanc vermouth. Blanc vermouth, sweet and white, but not that sweet. Again, French, so quite a bit less sweet than Italian, and usually with pretty delicate floral and herbal components. This is the kind of thing that you can mix, make more different gin drinks with, but also works well, I find, with a lot of aromatic clear spirits, with tequila, with mezcal, with pisco, with good white rums. I mean, the El Presidente cocktail is a fabulous drink to talk about now in the world of so many great white rums out there, which I believe you and Steve Yamada talked about last week. And often the other nice thing, especially when you're going to summer with a semi-sweet vermouth, blanc vermouth like that, is it can take to other sweeteners in the drink. So that could be a liqueur or something, but if you're looking for something for a patio, maybe only your seating is outside, that sweetness can come from fruit. Blanc vermouth is incredible with strawberries. It's incredible with watermelon. And those are drinks that are easy prep. It's basically, you know, plop, pour, fizz, and send it out the door. And that's so important as you deal with longer walks from the bar to tables and longer turnaround times for everything else because of sanitation and ordering issues and queuing. So yeah, blanc vermouth for aromatic spirits, for fruit, for relatively dry aperitifs for people who don't want as sweet a cocktail, and usually works well with some cheese, some lighter cheeses as well.
I think Plop, Port, Fizz is going to be the name of my prog rock band when I retire. That's a great, and I think it is. It's about that. You know, if you think of a busy service environment, you want, you know, minimal little touches. You want that you come back. One thing that to create the same every single time. It's about eliminating undue stress and that time management and being able to maximize the time you actually spend on the important stuff like hospitality, like making sure your guests are having a good time. And the less time you are kind of out of the way and the more time you can spend building that rapport with people, the better for everybody. So having a few of these drinks, even, you know, if you're working events and parties and stuff and you get that stampede of that initial kind of couple of hundred people, having something that you can bash like a punch style or something that is really easy, that looks impressive, it's got some fruit in it, it's got a really nice balanced flavor profile, but it's easy to execute. And I think that's such an important thing, that sometimes we overcomplicate our beverage menus and our drinks programs. And don't get me wrong, I love a well-made cocktail and I love to see the creativity of the modern bartender, which has evolved so much over the last 20 years. But I think there is a time and a place where less is more, and where simplicity is a beauty in and of itself, you know. And I think there's an opportunity with some of these products to actually have a really interesting flavor profile and a very interesting aroma profile that's complex and balanced, that you don't need to do too much to really kind of create something that's really very interesting and very refreshing and very enjoyable, that you want to go back and drink again. And I think so often I have a great cocktail and I think another one, you know. And I think it's that when you find that those drinks that you're like, oh, it's a porch sipper, you think I could sit and enjoy this all afternoon. I think those are the, like, in terms of revenue and profit and cash flow for a business, for a restaurant, I mean, those are gold.
That's exactly right. There's
yeah,
you know, the pour cost in these things is super low. The alcohol load, the total alcohol load is low. I mean, if your customers are all driving to your restaurant, or if you want them to just buy more drinks, to have that bottle of wine with dinner instead of having one glass of wine. And don't lose sight that long, you know, plop pour fizz drinks like that can still have spirits in them, but they can have less. You know, one of the things that I really love about mixing with agave spirits is that you can use the tiniest amount in a drink and still smell it. And so much about what an agave spirit brings to a drink is that nose. And most of what I want to drink in agave spirit cocktails doesn't have a lot of agave spirit in it, but if the agave spirit is good, then that's all you need.
For sure. And I think it's, again, it comes down to that, you know, a balanced drink that is greater than the sum of its parts. And I think that's just, again and again, we come back to these same ideas, and there's a reason for that, because they work. They're tried and tested formula that work. And that doesn't mean there isn't room for creativity, and that doesn't mean there isn't room for play. But, you know, if you've got really great tools, you can create a masterpiece. You know, if you don't have those tools, it's much harder to kind of fashion something that's going to be sturdy and stand the test of time.
Yeah,
that's the analogy I'm going with.
Tools and context. Yeah. If you make, go back to the Manhattan, if you make a big, rich, robust Manhattan with a big, rich, robust whiskey and a big, rich, robust vermouth, that's great. But if you've got 28 seats on a patio and that's all you're serving, and somebody's taking 25, 30 minutes to drink that Manhattan, then that's not the right Manhattan for your business. You know, and the same thing with drinks with any of these aromatized wines. You make sure they make sense for your context. Can they be made by your staff? Can they be sold by your servers? Because it's the servers that are selling them. A lot of places don't have bar seating or won't have bar seating for a while. And do they work in the context of how you get the right amount of revenue from each seat per unit time?
It's just, again, it's just, you know, simplifying things, bringing things down to that are easy to execute, easy to replicate, that are cost efficient, that make everybody's life easier and give the guest a great experience and a great beverage. I think, and if you're ticking those boxes, you're winning 9 times out of 10, you know. And I think that's where we love to overcomplicate things, you know. And, you know, the pair of us have been doing this for 10 or 20 minutes now. We've seen a few things, and, you know, the best experiences are always the simple ones. The best drinks are always the 2-3 ingredient drinks. You know, it's the simplest things are generally the truest expression of excellence and perfection. I think that's something we overlook too often. I think as we come through this and we perhaps start to reevaluate what hospitality is and what a successful bar or restaurant is, I think these are the key starting points for that conversation. I think it's like once, and I think that's back of house as well as front of house. I think that goes for the kitchen as well. I think, you know, people are going to go back to a lot more of that, you know, making sure we're utilizing everything, and, you know, that idea of zero or minimal waste. I think all of these things, and I think that's an interesting thing we haven't really touched on as well. It's like, if you know, there is use for these products beyond the bar as well. You know, they're great, you know, to use in culinary applications as well. I think that, you know, even just I've had some making ice cubes with aromatized wine instead of water, you know, and see as a drink changes as that ice starts to melt a little and dilute a little. I mean, there's so many playful ways you can introduce this, I think. So you maintain that creativity,
And
you know, without.
I mean,
Oh, for sure, which is key as well. You know, I think no one wants to have bottles sitting idle on in their refrigerator or on their back bar. So have a plan for how you can use these things. If you've got a beverage menu and every drink on there uses totally different spirits, totally different ingredients, something's wrong. You know, you want to be able to simplify that so that you don't have to stock 5 products for one drink. In the same way you wouldn't do that in the kitchen. You know, you wouldn't. It's funny how there's so many places I know and so many successful restaurateurs and bar operators I know who have a totally different philosophy for the back of house as the front of house. I'm like, the business philosophy should translate to both. You know, and that can be something as simple as you use the best ingredients in the kitchen, but you're using the cheapo olives on the bar. It can be something as simple as that, but that then kind of progresses throughout the whole philosophy and ideology of a place, I think. So I think there are ways of not cutting quality whilst maintaining all of those things that you need to be successful, I think.
Yeah. True.
So we have, it's getting deep. I haven't even started drinking yet. It's crazy. Let us talk about, we got 15 minutes left. There's plenty of time to wax lyrical on our 5th and final aromatized wine.
All right, and I think this is a really good place to put in a little plug for WSET, and in particular the level 3 spirits course for WSET.
That's my little plug.
That's his
See
little
what I
plug.
did there? I'll be here all week.
So that's what we're afraid of. Because I think the level 3 course does a great job of not just teaching, going in depth about knowledge about a lot of different categories, but starting to get into that the importance of knowing the diversity of those categories and how to taste for that diversity. And so I thought it was really important here to make sure we explicitly included an aromatized wine that was not a vermouth. The first 4 in theory could have all ended up as vermouths. The dark, rich aromatized wine could have been a vermouth amaro or something like that. But I wanted to make sure what we're missing is something geared toward clear spirits, so white or pink probably, often driven by the flavor of the wine, and not a vermouth. So an Americano from Italy or a Quinquina from France, most likely. Americano is the Italian term for wines that are bittered with gentian. They tend to be quite sweet and quite bitter, and the best ones have, again, that texture of wine and often have the flavor of wine because their producers are winemakers and want to show off their wines. Quinquina from France is a more modern category. Quinine in beverages doesn't really appear until the 1800s in Europe, but Quinquina rose in France in the late 1800s and became much of the driver of a lot of the sort of popular art and poster art that you see. Certainly some of the products in our portfolio were very big in that whole poster world in the 1890s and the aughts and teens. But Quinquina, so there's a diversity of Quinquina styles based on where the Quinquina is from. A Quinquina from the Alps will be more bracing and sort of bitter driven. A Quinquina from a warm place like the Roussillon in the south of France or maybe Corsica will have a bit of that taste of sunshine from the wine. But what we find is that these sorts of aromatized wines, especially the Italian ones that are sweeter, can make for drinks that hew closest to what we think of as the modern idea of the spritz, something that's on the sweet side, has some bitterness, and it's very long. The nice thing about using an aromatized wine for that drink, as opposed to a spirit-based Amaro, is you don't need to pop that bottle of sparkling wine as well, because that vinous character, that acid and texture that Rob talked about so well, is provided by the aromatized wine. You just have to add soda. The other thing that we find is that a lot of more modern botanical spirits, certainly gins, but also aquavit and other things like that, and as well as some other non-botanical spirits, but mainly talk about botanical spirits, tend to work better with quinquinas and Americano than they do with vermouth. If they're also herbaceous, if your gin or your other botanical spirit is heavily herbaceous, well, wormwood is also herbaceous, and so it might not work as well with vermouth as it would work with something else that hits a different part of the palate and has a different flavor profile. And, you know, face it, if you're reopening a bar and you're in an interesting place, chances are you've got local distillers that have been stopping production for to make hand sanitizer, but still want to sell you their local products. And often those products could use a little extra sugar because they might be astringent or dry, or maybe a young whiskey or a gin that's very floral or herbal. And it's these aromatized wines that'll work really, really well with those kind of spirits often. So gives you a chance to use kind of the rest of your back bar, but also gives you a chance to do that even simpler drink that doesn't have to be doctored up at all with soda.
Well, and again, that the highball is, for me, is the greatest test of a spirit or aromatized wine. I mean, if it works well just on its own, charged with something fizzy on a warm day, it's a winner. You know, and back to your point in terms of dilution and using, you know, soda instead of just water, I think it's an important thing. And you get, obviously, from the carbon dioxide in that creates a different textural component on the palate as well. It adds acidity. So I think there are lots of interesting elements to that. And I do think that idea of that kind of cafe culture, that idea of just, you know, it's a very European ideal, I think, and you know, but it's something that translates very well. And I think, you know, in terms of modern drinking and dining, it's very much about that experience of being able to walk place to play, drink, have a snack. This idea of not sitting down in one place for 3 hours, this big meal, particularly moving forward when, you know, we want to be outside, we don't want to be stuck in one place too long, surrounded by a lot of people. This plays and lends very nicely to this ideal, I think. And you mentioned level 3 spirits, and I hate to shamelessly plug my own products, but I mean, obviously, I do want everyone to realize how Jake was instrumental in helping us put together the chapters here for aromatized wine. I think Nick King, the guy who wrote the book, would be the first to admit that, and you'll be able to ask him yourself. I'll ask him next week because he's on the session with me on Scotch whiskey next week. But I do think it's a category that, you know, we need to understand better. We need to understand the diversity of it, the versatility of it. And, you know, there are so many great products out there that, you know, when you look at those variables, when you start thinking about different wine base, different ways of sweetening, bittering agents beyond vermouth, whether it's gentian, whether it's quinine, other botanicals that might be in the mix, all of these different elements, it's no different to distillation, in my opinion. I mean, if you think of distillation just being one thing, it's not. There's different sizes and shapes of stills. There's different ways I can run my still. There's different places I can make cut points. I think there's a lot of correlation there when we look at aromatized wines. It's like any beverage, like any product. It's about where I pull those levers, and every input is going to have an output. And I think once you understand what those inputs are and how they relate to each other and how they affect the output, that's the key to understanding aromatized wines, I think.
And I think I want to piggyback on a couple of things there to kind of recap back to the beginning when we talked about how to taste these things. And
sure, Tommy, would you like to put up that the slide, Tommy, that covers the 5 wines we've talked about, so that people can see those while Jake and I kind of recap and review? Thank you, Tommy.
Thank you, Tommy. you know, that and Tommy was very good at putting out to the group in the chat the kind of how to taste function, but that tasting with soda, because that's how you're going to serve it, but tasting your trial spirits at equal parts. If a spirit, and this is particularly important when you're working with botanical spirits, gins, things like that, if a spirit really works with an aromatized wine, it will almost always work at 50-50. And those drinks are easier to batch, easier to train, easier to get out, easier to order for. And that's all of those things that the last thing that as we all kind of see where we go in the restaurant and bar world, or as a retailer thinking about easy drinks to recommend for a customer, as we all try to see where we're going here, that being able to simplify the mechanical part of it so that you can be good to your customer and to your employees is going to be even more important. And so the thing that I've found for a very long time now is if two spirits really work well together, chances are they work together 50-50. And a lot of those mixtures can often be drunk as highballs as well. They don't have to be stirred into this beautiful, delicate little drink, and they don't have to be soured to within an inch of their life. To recap,
I think that again, to piggyback on you, piggyback on my piggybacking, I think it's that simplicity that I think oftentimes we forget. Like from a brand perspective, if I'm making an aromatized wine, if I'm a producer, it's great having it listed in a bar and seeing it on a cocktail menu and being talked about by the cool bartenders and written about in cool magazines. But you really know it's successful when consumers are buying it and it's in their refrigerators at home. And when it's flying off the retail shelves as well. And I think oftentimes we focus too much on the bar side and not enough on, these are really easy drinks for people to make at home. And it's like if you are a home bartender or you're just someone who enjoys entertaining at home, aromatized wines give you that versatility to be able to knock up something that's really interesting, a great talking point, and it all drives each other. People see it in the bars, they see it used in drinks. You want that synergy of people for me, I don't want my products to just be drunk in a bar. I want people having it at home as well. And I think that's where we're getting to now. I mean, you're starting to see more and more people get aromatized wine. They're starting to realize that dusty old bottle in the back of the liquor cabinet that's been half empty for 5 years probably isn't going to be in its prime condition. And but they're starting to realize how to use them. And let's be honest, it's no wonder people started putting less and less vermouth in their martinis and Manhattans when the bottle of vermouth wasn't particularly good, because it was old, it was tired, it was oxidized. And I think when you introduce people to these products fresh and vibrant, and then with the diversity from within them, people get excited and people are fascinated to explore more. So I think that is just a really important takeaway here as well. These aren't just
forget that bars can be bottle shops in a lot of places.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing, and this is the thing. Now that people are doing cocktails to go, and a lot of states now are allowing people to sell batch drinks with food for to-go orders and that. I think this is a massive part of this. It's a great way because it's weird. I'm interested with like dram shop laws and different third-party liability and stuff moving forward. There are certain states that have some quite strange blue laws. So knowing that you're sending something out that isn't likely to cause someone to get so drunk that they do something silly, so you feel good about the fact that it's socially responsible, but it's also a really great drink. And I think that's an interesting side of this moving forward that I think people will exploit and do well with, I think. And I think as we start to reimagine our drinking and dining landscape, I don't think that's going to go away. And I think you're going to start to see more and more of these pre-packed, pre-batched mixed drinks that are either branded by a bar or branded by a place. And I think that's going to be a really interesting and fertile ground for experimentation moving forward.
I would like to do a quick recap. So we have a couple of minutes left. on the 5 categories. Of course, as you might imagine, my company does sell products in these categories, but I'll let you guys, out of respect for WSET and our hosts here, I'll let you guys, we'll have some contact information in a moment. But dry vermouth and red vermouth, of course, the icons for martini and Manhattan and related drinks. And then looking at other things to mix brown spirits with, something dark and rich, a wine-based Amaro or maybe a vermouth Amaro, and then a couple of very different categories for mixing with clear spirits or making simple spritzes. Something semi-dry, this is usually going to be a Blanc vermouth, number 4, and then something sweeter, often from Italy and Americano, but also some quinquinas work very well in this context where you can make a nice rich spritz or mix with a lot of different clear spirits.
Well, I don't know about you, but
Rob
I'm
for having me
quite
on.
thirsty.
This was pretty amazing.
Tommy, would you care to bring up our final slide, please? Well, no, thank you, Jake. I mean, this has been great fun, and I think it's challenging because sometimes people aren't sure whether aromatized wine should be classed more with wine or more with spirits, but that's what I love about it. It's not easy to categorize. It is all things to all people, which is why I think it's such an important part of a beverage program. But it has been great chatting with you for the last hour. I always enjoy our conversations, and now we're sharing them with a broader audience. Normally, it's just the two of us late night in a Chinese restaurant, but this has been great fun. For everybody, there's Jake's contact information there. Plus, if you're interested in learning more about Jake's portfolio, there's Haus Alpenz website there. For me, there is my contact information, my Instagram. You can find us on Facebook. Obviously, for specifics about WSET courses, please feel free to go to wsetglobal.com and find a course provider near you. That is pretty much all we have time for today. So thank you, Jake. Thank you all for taking an hour out of your day to spend time with us and listen to us wax lyrical. Thank you, Tommy, BCB, and everybody behind the scenes. I will be back next week to talk Scotch whiskey with the guy who actually wrote, where did I put that book? The guy who actually wrote this book. So the guy who wrote our Level 3 Spirits book, Nick King, will be with me next week to talk about his 5 picks for Scotch whiskey. Like I said, everyone will get a copy of this recording sent to them via email. Please feel free to reach out. Please be nice to each other. Please stay safe, stay well, and I hope to see you all next Tuesday at the same time. Good afternoon. Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.